We're in 1 Timothy chapter 5 this week, and it's we're getting to a place, I have a feeling that if you just read this, most of you are going to say, yeah, I know about that. And there's a sense in which, yeah, we do, but it's the kind of thing that, yeah, we sit there and say, yeah, I know that, I know that, I know that, and then someday we slip up and trip on some very normal little things that we need to be a little bit careful about. Just to remind you, Paul's writing to Timothy. Timothy is a young pastor, probably roughly age 30, has spent 12 to 15 years traveling with Paul and being discipled. And Paul said, that group of believers down there in Ephesus, that is such a significant place, highly significant, and I need somebody really trustworthy. And so this was Timothy's first commission. This was his first ministry out of the chute. And boy, he had some things he had to deal with in this. Turns out that there were some people who had made themselves into significant positions in the church that were teaching false doctrine, thoughts and things that just were not accurate or true. And Paul addresses some of that as he goes through. He keeps talking about different things that were going on. There were, at one point in chapter 3, we looked at the qualifications of leadership. And some of that's probably because there were people who were wiggling their way in that really didn't deserve to be in those positions of influence. And leadership is influence. That's exactly what it is. And so they were trying to get themselves in. So Paul was as much reminding Timothy, but he was sure telling the rest of the church, and it's helped all of us down through the centuries as well. Chapter 4, we looked at something that is termed in there as the doctrine of demons, and there was just a whole slew of things that we went through last week, and just a whole bunch of things that were from what some people would say from the pit of hell. It's just stuff that doesn't have any business being in a church. And today we're going to cover some of chapter 5. And again, this is going to be stuff that you're going to look at and you're going to say, you know what? I know this stuff. And maybe we do this, but it's a good thing for us to look at. And we're going to stop at verse 16, which means in a couple weeks when we pick this up again, we're going to hit another level. This level is going to be about just some of the normal relationships inside the church and what do we do when there's sin, and then just a special classification of care and support. And then when we come back again, actually it'll be, believe it or not, it'll be like March 15th when we do Timothy again. Then we're going to hit a really tough passage, but it's an okay one to deal with, necessary to deal with. We know that, where it talks about what do you do with an elder in a church that's failing, who fails spiritually and falls into sin. So we'll deal with that one in a few more weeks. And so today we're going to cover some normal everyday things. So you can kind of take a deep breath and sigh and say, good, this is a little bit easier today in some ways. Kind of interesting, Paul, when he writes to Timothy, but even when he's written other letters, Paul likes to use a lot of metaphors as when he talks about Christians and what we're like. He uses some, and we can see them throughout the New Testament, some others as well. Some things that are used when we describe the church. It's called the holy nation. It's called a kingdom. It's a priesthood. Jesus talks about a vine. It's called a temple, the body, an assembly, a flock. There's all kinds of metaphors. Metaphors are pictures that take one picture that connects to something else. And all those things just bring up images in our mind of what it's supposed to be like for those of us who come together as a group of believers and try to minister one to the other on an ongoing basis. And in here, Paul is going to use, as he so often does, the metaphor that the church is as a family. It's like a family. And it's like that because of intimacy that's here. We know each other. I know I can say this for absolute sure, and I think a lot of you can say this, but I know you and you know me way better than any other person who is physical, other than my kids, um, my own family, my past family, from my my parents and all that kind of stuff. Because I don't have any contact. My sister's the only one I have contact with, and I avoid that as much as I can. So I'm not really, but I prefer to avoid it if I can. So I know that I'm a lot closer to you than I am any of that side of family, um, and so that's the picture that the church is, in a sense, our family, and there's intimacy there because you know me better and I know them better, and know you better than I do them, and there's a care that happens in this, and that's what we're going to be talking about here, is that kind of care and support and things that we need to offer to each other. There's an openness that's here that I share things with you that I never shared, on an individual basis, but I wouldn't have shared them with my parents, and certainly wouldn't with my sister or anybody else like that, because they wouldn't understand, but you do, and obviously that comes out of a heart of love for each other, and that's what the family of God, the picture of the church, is supposed to be like. Well, there was a spiritual family there in Ephesus, and Timothy was the leader of that, and Paul was giving instruction to Timothy, but that was being overheard by the group of people in Ephesus. So it's a combination of Timothy, make sure you keep doing what's right, and a combination combined with, hey, people in the church, this is what's right. Let Timothy do what is right. And so that's kind of how the approach is. In that particular body of believers, there were some sinning members. Some had abandoned the truth. Some had shipwrecked their own faith. Some of the women were stepping out over the boundaries of where they should be and trying to place themselves in positions they shouldn't have been. Other leaders were trying to be leaders who were unqualified to be leaders. And some had taught demonic false doctrines. So here we're going to see, how do you handle some of that stuff in the church? How do you handle some of the sin problems? And we're going to see that one of the problems, which maybe we don't relate to real well, and we'll talk about that a lot in just a few minutes, is one of unsupported people who are not having their everyday needs cared for. And apparently it was really big. And in that case, I started trying to think, and I haven't had a chance to work all this out, but I'm trying to find out what was the difference in Ephesus than, let's say, in Jerusalem. Because we read in Scripture that the Jerusalem believers were coming together, especially in Acts 4 and 5, and they were sharing everything in common. And so when somebody had a need, the other believers just jumped right up and took care of that. And there was a lot of good stuff going on there. And we see some of the other churches, like the church at Thessalonica, had supported Jerusalem and the believers there. So there was a lot of going back and forth. But I kind of got the impression in Ephesus, at least for the spell when Timothy was going to go there, that maybe that wasn't the case of what was happening. Well, let's jump into it. Enough of an introduction. Let's go into 1 Timothy 5, and I'm going to read verses 1 and 2 to begin with. Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Now that, unfortunately for preachers, that's pretty clear. There's not a whole lot to illustrate there. When it comes to what happens when somebody in the congregation has done something wrong or they've sinned, I'm not talking about a major thing. We've all seen that, and there are guidelines and stuff, but just, everyday life, relational things, something's goofed up, something's out of sort. How do you do that? How do you handle that thing? And Paul told Timothy and reminded him of a couple categories, and said, basically, do not rebuke sharply. Don't do this with harshness, but you still rebuke. You still go to people and you still say, you know what you're doing, what you're thinking, the way you're acting is not according to what God's standards would be. We do that here primarily not because we love picking on people. Believe me, we hate doing this kind of stuff, but we do it here because we love you, and we don't want your life to get out of sorts, and we want you to be in a position where God can bless you and work in your life. We don't think you should just run wild with your life and do whatever you would like to do. The phrase here really is one where Paul's saying to him, appeal to that person. And I don't know if we feel the emotion of the word appeal, but it's, go to them and with great love and compassion for them and help them. And then he just gives categories, because remember, he's a young man, chapter 4, verse 12, where it said, don't let anybody look down on your youth. And I had told you that word, and we're going to talk about that in a couple weeks again. But that word was used for people the military age, from teens to about 40. That's what they thought was young in that time. And so he says to him, when you're confronting older men, and you'll need to do that from time to time, you got to confront, and you look at them with great respect, but you treat them like it was your father. That's what Paul said. And then when you're dealing with the younger men, now don't look down on them and act like, well, I am so farther along than you are. You are so immature. That's not how we do that. We treat them like a brother with no air of superiority. When you're confronting an older woman, and sometimes, some of the older women will just do things that are inappropriate or get a little bit out of the way. He said, treat them like they were your mother. And then when he talks about confronting younger women, he says, treat them like they were your sister. Okay, all that sounds nice and normal. For some reason, he adds a couple things to the sister part. And I think this is safe, because when you have a 30-year-old guy, and boy, Timothy was really a guy. And so, 30 years old. And when it came to confronting a younger woman, a younger lady, maybe in her teens or 20s or even 30s, he says not only treat her like a sister, but he adds with absolute purity. And I'm not suggesting anything, but how many times in Christendom in the United States today have you seen guys in leadership fail? I mean, they do. And I don't know of anybody who wakes up in the morning and says, boy, today, what a great idea. I think I put on my to-do list that I'm going to fail miserably today. That's what I'm going to intend to do that. And if my ducks get in a row, this will be scandalous. And everybody, wow, that's a great idea. Nobody does that. Nobody does that. But yet it happens, doesn't it? And I'm convinced, first of all, that every time somebody commits a sin, that somewhere in the process, they say yes. Somewhere in the process. I don't know of any sin, and I've thought about this for decades. I haven't yet come up with a sin where it was like, man, that just happened. Boy, did that blindside me. I had no idea that was ever going to happen. But somewhere along the line, we all say yes, to jaywalking. You look both ways and say, there's nobody. I remember the time Officer Fioca, I had a meeting with him that morning, and I was running late. Who would have thought of that? 7 o'clock in the morning. And so I went down Pleasant View, and there's a stop sign. And I stopped sort of. And I rolled around, and there was nothing coming. And as I went driving by, he's sitting right there in the high school parking lot in his cruiser, shaking his head no. And of course, I pulled in, because you get executive privileges. And so I went to the meeting, and he came and he sat down beside me. He said, don't do that again. And so the next day when I had a meeting with him, he was highly encouraged. You can ask him about this. I had told him, Paul, you would have been pleased. I sat for 3 minutes at that stop sign, because it's all retroactive, right? And well, no, maybe it's not. But there was a conscious decision. I was in a hurry. I glanced. I mean, I'm athletic. I've got the world's greatest peripheral vision. There's nothing around. I zipped through, and I know what the morning school traffic's like. And I beat it all, and I was doing great, but it was wrong. It was wrong. And that's silly, rolling stop signs, jaywalking. But we do that with every issue in our lives, and not a one of us are totally innocent of that. And we need to be sure of absolute purity, and there's things that we just need to be warned about. Okay, then it gets into some really interesting things as we go on here. Some of the obligations of the Christian church and what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to take care of widows. I'm going to read just a couple of the verses here. Verse 3 and 4 I'll start with. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. Now, when we come down to verse 8, it says, if anyone maybe does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And then in verse 16, it says, if any woman who is a believer has widows in her family, she should help them and not let the church be a burden with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. So we're going to talk about caring for the widows and caring for those who have special needs. Now, I don't know what the situation was exactly there, because in Jerusalem and in so many other places where Judaism had a big impact on the Christian church, Judaism did a great job of caring for their family members. They're the pattern of how it should be. And when some of them became believers and were part of the church, that practice just carried right on in with them, and they did a good job. But Ephesus had a little bit more of a Greek influence, and we know anything outside of Christianity had a very, very, very low opinion of the female gender. They just were not treated well, not with a lot of respect at all. So we know that God does care for widows. In Psalm 68, verse 5, a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows is God in his holy dwelling. God cares deeply for that. I give you a list of other verses you can look up, and it's not a surprise that one of the first ministries that started in the early church in Acts chapter 6, and we talk about that being the deacon position, but it all was around caring for the needs of the widows of that day in that church. And so God has a real heart for those who maybe are on the outside, who are just a little bit alone. And obviously, when Jesus Christ was on the cross, as he was hanging on the cross, one of the last things he did was he commissioned his dearly beloved friend John to take care of his mother, who was probably a widow at that time and now losing her oldest son. And he said, behold your son, behold the mother, and tells him to take care of her. A very deep passion in God's heart is to care for those who have specific needs. And in the Christian church inherited that, I think, from Israel. They had a system that cared for the welfare of women. And you can read the book of Ruth if you like to, and that details it very, very beautifully. However, we saw in these verses, the church is not a welfare agency. Okay? That's not what we're here to do. That's not what we try to do. The church is to take care of those only who are destitute, and only when their Christian family is unable to care for that. Our church actually tries to do that. We don't do it well, and we don't do it perfectly by any sense, but we try to do that. I know most of you, if you participate in our offering system, you've probably seen from time to time on the envelope there's a category called F, period, A, period, F, period. And maybe some have thought, what in the world is that? We call that our Family Assistance Fund. And we use that for people who are in unique and unusual circumstances and have needs. We don't have anybody at this moment. There's no one at this moment, but we have in the past. We don't have anybody who is a widow who is receiving ongoing monthly support from that, but we have in the past. We have used it. Right now, it's being used mostly for unique needs of people, and I checked on it just before I came in. Before you gave your offering today, there were about $450 in the fund. And so that's something we use, and we try to help families in need. We try to keep that to just church family. That's a unique we tried to do that. Although there was a time last year where we did some unique things for someone in the community, and we did that this year as well. We did something uniquely for someone in the community, a very unusual thing that the elders approved. It's a very highly confidential area, and we try to do that as well as we can. But it's for only those very unique situations. Now, I don't remember which screen I have it written down, but there's 3 times, I didn't remember which I had coming next, but there's 3 times in this text where it talks about a woman. In the King James it says, a widow indeed. It's found in verse 3, it's found in verse 5, it's found in verse 16. And I think in the NIV, which I read from, it says a widow in need. And I think that's a little bit weak. I like the widow indeed, although nobody knows what that means. But I think that is a little bit more accurate. But what it actually means, it's those who are absolutely bereft of help. They don't have a husband. They don't have children to support them. There was no inheritance. There was nothing. And in their day, that was a whole lot more normal. In our day, there's a lot of times we have things prepared financially for that situation. There's insurance policies. There may be retirement incomes. A lot of the men and women in our church who come a little bit older are set up to where they can sustain themselves. It's a good system that we have. There's a lot of good things. So we don't see the number of people in this category that they probably saw in their day. It also it literally means somebody who's been robbed, having suffered loss, or left alone. And I think Paul is using it mostly with the idea of left alone. There's no help for them. They just really can't make it on their own. And this is very tough. If you remember this situation where Jesus was walking through a town and he came upon a funeral, and it happened to be the funeral of a young lad, probably in his teens, and it was the widow of son, and she had no man in her life. And of course, the typical funeral, they were all grieving and crying and doing their rituals, but Jesus was moved to compassion, great compassion, because he knew the fate of that woman living in their culture without any male assistance in her life. They were in danger sometimes physically, sometimes, but particularly financially, in great danger. And Jesus was so moved about that he actually walked over and raised the young lad back to life and then restored him to her. And he was able to, I'm sure, go on and assist his mom in some of the needs. We are responsible. It is an obligation for us to care for other believers as much as we possibly can when they are left alone. There's a great verse in James that it starts off by saying, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this. Okay, I don't have that on the screen. It's too much for you on the screen. But pure religion, James saying, if you want to be sincere and pure in your walk with Christ, in your Christianity, pure religion, it's undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. Live a pure and holy life, but that's not enough. You need to do more. You need to do things like help those who don't have a father. Now, there's a lot of young people who probably have a physical father, but they may not really have a father. You know what I mean, don't you? There's a lot of situations where maybe dad is invisible, or maybe dad's not a spiritual leader, or maybe dad's not really a part. We have a growing youth group. It is wonderful. It is wonderful what's going on in there. And there's a lot of young people that are coming that they come from tough situations. It used to be when I first went in ministry 30 years ago, and I had a huge group that we grew in Worcester. 1 or 2 of those kids came from tough situations, and it was, you paid more attention to those kids and you helped them as much as you could. 1 or 2. Now it's the reverse, and it isn't a Rittman thing. Trust me, its world. Rittman may talk about it out loud and deal with it, but everybody has it. But now, when we have the one or two that were like the majority 30 years ago, that's unusual. We have one or two that mom and dad are very godly, very involved, and caring deeply, and then most of the others are in, and they're okay. They're doing well. They're great kids, but they just need a little more encouragement. And things are a little different today than what they used to be. And widows, there's women who need encouragement, need help, and that's our job, all of us. It's not the pastor's job, although it is, but it's no more the pastor's than it is everybody else's. So those are things that we would be told that we need to do and should do well. Where there's no relatives to provide, then the church needs to step up and do her part. And that's what Paul is trying to remind them. I don't know what they were doing or what they were not doing, but they needed to do just a little bit better. I'm going to read verses 5 through 7 and just catch another thing. This is a little bit different here. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give the people these instructions too, so that no one may be open to blame. He's contrasting two different situations here, and he's saying, the godly woman is the one who has gone through this circumstance, and she really understands her dependency upon God, how important it is for her to pray, and she knows that her only hope is in God. Now that's a sad situation. A lot of times when we feel that way, there's a lot of people who say, the only thing I have is my hope in God. And that's a tough place to be, but that there's something good and right about that too. It's a great place to be when God is the only hope that we have. But the opposite was here, and he'll say a few things about these kind of people. I think the King James uses a phrase, the merry widow. This is the one who's probably a little bit younger, but she's living it up, and there's a newfound freedom for her, and it can lead to pleasures that are taken without thought of right or wrong. And that's what Paul was seeing in that day, and Timothy was dealing with, and Paul was saying, we need to be careful about that. We need to challenge that younger woman to consider the consequences of what she's doing. You come to verse 8, and I read that earlier for you, and it sort of is the reverse of verse 4. Verse 4 says, you're commanded to take care of the widows that are in your family. You're supposed to do that. Verse 8 talks about those who don't do that. And it says that they are actually worse than the heathen. They claim to be believers and they claim to be Christians, but they don't take care of those in their own family. And it goes on to say things like a man who does not provide for his family shows that he does not have the faith that he's professing to have. He's worse than anyone who's never made a profession at all. Some people would call that a hypocrite type thing. In the Greek law, which a lot of them understood at that day, the Greek law legally bound people to the support of their parents. Anyone who refused to support their parents in a time of need lost all of their civil rights. And it was unheard of in their day. Now, I don't think that's our culture today. That's not the way we are. Verses 9 and 10 talk about qualifications to be enrolled. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of saints, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. The list. There's some list, and they kept a list there. It was an organized group, and probably this list, some think that the list was those that you were allowed to give financial support to. But I don't think so, because of several reasons. One is that he's saying they got to be 60 years old. And I'm not so sure that Um, it looks to other places here that it was okay to help and support those who were younger than that. So I don't think it's just that. It's probably a list of those who have been enlisted to do certain ministries as a part of that group, because they're able to do some things that other people are not able to do. First of all, they have a wealth of wisdom. If you caught the DVD earlier, it's telling us not to discount those people who are just a little bit older. They have a wealth of wisdom that comes with them. I was in Worcester on Friday, part of the funeral. Faye Moore, our wonderful secretary at Worcester, passed away, real dear friend. And the comrades that were all there who stayed and particularly were part of the meal were all the people who were there when I was there on staff. And so it's a fun reunion for me to see people I haven't seen for a long time, and to think, and they're godly people. And I sit in that room and you think the experts say, it's time to get a rocking chair. And I look at that and I say, this is an incredible group of people. We have them too, an incredible group of people with great talents and great abilities. It's not a time to back off. It's a time to move forward and do great things in serving the Lord. There's experiences that they have that a lot of people need to know about, because I often say the best way to learn a lesson is by somebody else's mistake. I don't want to learn it by my mistake, although I get plenty of that, but I'd rather do. And that group has available time. They have available time. Some of them are not tied down with work situations. So he listed a bunch of things. Age 60. In their culture, for some reason, 60 was sort of, I called it retirement years, but that's not what they called it. They said they ceased from activities to live a reflective life. I don't know how much they followed that through. But it lists other things too. Marital integrity, good works. They brought up their children. They were faithful mothers, and they lodged strangers, hospitality. They assisted those who were in distress. And it says that they washed the saints' feet. Now that's always interesting to read commentaries on that, because I don't always agree with them. Some of them go into, well, this is talking about humility, if they were humble people. Oh, wash the saints' feet. So we're to be humble before the Christians, but not before the world. It's just saying, be humble to Christians, not the rest. Hospitality is what it may be talking about, and service. But again, just for Christians. I really believe fully, and we won't go into this any deeper than this, but I believe it's talking about participating in the communion type service that Jesus instituted the night before he was crucified, where it involved the feast of a meal, it involved the bread and the cup, and involved the washing of feet, just as he did and as he asked us to do. And I think it's just basically saying, is this person faithful in executing the things that God has asked us to do? So that, plus they relieved the afflicted, they showed mercy to people, they were diligent to follow every good work. Well, there was a little problem here, and I'm going to read verses 11 to 15, and hopefully we can come up with just a real easy summary to help us know what it's about. As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list, for when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house, and not only do they become idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things they ought not to do. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have in fact already turned away to follow Satan. I have no idea who he knew in Ephesus that was a younger widow. There's probably a couple of them that they lost their husbands, and that wasn't unusual because their life expectancy was considerably lower than it is today. I don't know who he's targeting in his writing, Paul is, but apparently there were some that were Christians, and as this situation became their lot in life, that they've responded and acted in different ways. And as opposed to the widows who saw their dependency and their hope on God, these saw this as a time they had maybe some freedom, maybe even had some financial help in their situation, or maybe they had young boys or young men in their family that could help carry them a little bit. They had time. They went around and they under the guise of ministry, they went to different people's houses, and Paul at least saw it as more gossip than prayer request. Yeah, that's a fine line, isn't it? Anybody who's ever been in that category knows that that's a hard thing to do. And it's normal for them to want to remarry when they're young, but some of them pursued the flesh more, and they became guilty of sin against God and the church. I don't think that this is a command by Paul. I think he's just saying, much like in 1 Corinthians 7, the first couple verses, where Paul was saying, in that case, you're in a dating relationship, but you're in a situation where everything else is working out fine. God's will, all that is going really well. But he tells them in 1 Corinthians 7 that a guy and a girl should not touch in a way that causes arousal, sexual arousal. And then he says to them, but if that's what's happening and everything else checks out, you know what? It's a whole lot better to get married now than to fail and have problems in your relationship as time goes on. And I think it's sort of the same kind of thing here. He's saying to them, it's good, it's okay to be unattached. It's all right to do that, and you can have a good life, and God will bless you and honor you. You're not half or incomplete or anything like that. But if you're getting yourself in a situation where you're following the flesh and you're going to be guilty of sin against God and the church, then maybe it's best that you go ahead and check out God's will and go ahead and be married if that's what God is calling you to do. Sometimes Paul was wondering if the support of some of these people by the church and by other families was affording them too much time, free time, for them to indulge more in sin. And he just recommended marriage over sin, if that's something that they were in need of. And he says, in fact, Satan has already captured some of those people. And it's interesting that he used the name Satan as opposed to any of the other names he could have, because it speaks about an adversary. And so Satan is pulling them down. Well, all that stuff is normal, easy stuff that goes on every day in the church. We all say, well, we take care of people in our church, and we do. We try to watch out. If somebody needs something, we try to help them if there's any way that we can do that. Probably the two extremes that we would see is the one where people immediately turn to the church instead of their family. You got a family member that could do this to help. They're believers. They're obligated to help you. You're causing them to sin if you don't let them help you, because that's what they're called to do. That's one extreme. The other extreme is if people neglected those who really were deeply in need, and that would be wrong. God wants us to live in a way and to relate within the confines of the family of God in such a way that it is encouraging to everybody else and attractive to the outside world. Jesus said even that night before he was crucified that he was giving a new commandment, and he said that new commandment was that we were to love one another. In the confines of the family of God, we are to love one another. And he said as we did that, as we practiced that and lived that out, then outsiders would see that in us and be drawn toward God and his grace. So we're to live that way. Part of that is when we do that, it's as though we are carrying that light of that testimony that God has placed in us to the rest of the world. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you so much for your goodness and your grace, and we want to live in such a way that we bring glory and honor to you through our relationships, through our doing the things right. We fully recognize that we fail more often than we succeed, but it is our desire, God, to be used of you to have healthy, spiritual, godly relationships with everyone we know, everyone we meet, and do it in such a way that it pleases you. Lord, just take our lives and let it be a light to this world. And we ask it in Christ's name.